Looking down at a microscope slide containing his own blood, Peter Parker is able to confirm something he's been growing suspicious of. He's been growing weaker as the radiation in his blood is slowly draining. It means his time has come. He can no longer be Spider-Man. A distressed Spider-Man finds himself growing confused and desperate. He's growing weaker and weaker by the minute, barely able to stand up straight as he tries to swing his way through New York City. Unsure of what to do, he approaches his girlfriend, Gwen Stacy, who's having a party with all of their friends over to celebrate her birthday. A very confused Peter Parker enters the scene and, shocking Gwen, her father, Captain Stacy, and Peter's friends, Harry Osborn and Mary Jane, that Peter was Spider-Man, and that his career as a superhero is finally over. Peter's gathered friends and family are shocked at this news, but before the man can explain himself, he rushes off, dizzy and not making any sense. Peter can't believe what he just did, wondering if he's gone crazy, and is unable to think straight. Gwen, meanwhile, is on the verge of hysteria, unable to believe that her Peter could be capable of being a menace such as Spider-Man. It reminds Harry of an earlier incident, where Peter was caught posing as Spider-Man after the supposed hero was unmasked by the villain known as Dr. Octopus. Peter was reprimanded for this by the police following the incident, and Harry thought that was the end of it. His close friend can't believe that Peter would try something like this a second time. Gwen wonders if it wasn't an act that first time, and if he really has been Spider-Man all along. Mary Jane remarks that Gwen can sure pick them. He's either a masked menace or a complete psycho case. Peter, disguised as Spider-Man, is later discovered by a nurse and a doctor, and they take him into their hospital. The hero has the worst case of the flu the doctor's ever seen. But, thanks to his superpowers, Spider-Man's also able to heal faster than any other patient the doctor's seen before. The hero is thankful for the doctor's care and, apparently, discretion, as he didn't unmask the hero, and he takes off into the city. However, the damage regarding Peter's secret identity has been done. It was natural that he was so confused. The flu does that to everybody, but now he has to figure out a way to undo all the damage he did at Gwen's party. After spending an evening pondering the matter, Peter comes up with an idea. It's a long shot, but the only thing he can think of that'll get him out of this mess. He approaches a man named Hobby Brown, who Peter recently encountered as Spider-Man when Hobby took up the identity of the Prowler. Hobby feels like he owes Spider-Man, so he agrees to help with this job, no questions asked. Shortly afterward, Peter arrives at the Stacy home, explaining that he was sick and confused, making a fool of himself at the party last night. He promises that he had just run into Spider-Man and this was all a misunderstanding, the drama of which Mary Jane finds quite amusing. Suddenly, Spider-Man, secretly Hobby disguised as the hero, shows up and confirms that Peter Parker is not in fact Spider-Man. With the job completed and even Captain Stacy convinced, Hobby takes off, knowing that he's repaid the favor to the superhero, while Peter is able to reconcile with Gwen. Peter is glad everything is worked out, but he has trouble accepting all of this. He came very close to losing Gwen once and for all. And while he's not, for once, the low man in the totem pole on life, it still feels like he's walking on the edge. Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and this is my recap and review of The Amazing Spider-Man number 87. So we're trying something for the second time that I quite enjoyed back from our last little Christmas season, through a mini-series called The 12 Days of Detective Comics. If you guys missed it, the idea was I was just reviewing 12 issues of Detective Comics at random, decided completely randomly without any input from me whatsoever. And we're going to do that again in a new series I'm calling Random Reviews. a set of 10 reviews of any given series or character or setting or concept in comic books completely randomly, looking at whatever issues these characters might have appeared in without any design on my part. I literally just input a sequence number into random.org, and whatever it gives me I use to pick 10 issues that the character has appeared in across all of their media in the world of comic books. And this time, for our first run of this little series, I put up a series of characters on Patreon for our patrons to pick, and Mary Jane is the winner. So we begin with our first randomly chosen issue, The Amazing Spider-Man number 87, a classic in the truest sense of the word. A comic that I actually remember reading from God knows how long ago, but is just such an ingrained, important issue in Spider-Man history that of course I remember it. This comic is so many things at once. Not only is it a key moment in Spider-Man history, defining a long-standing secondary character in Spider-Man lore in the form of Hobie Brown as the Prowler, and making the Prowler out to be an interesting, more complex character than the typical rogue gallery in Spider-Man's roster of supporting costumed figures. It's also a Stan Lee comic featuring Mary Jane, and that's going to be important as we go through this character's history. After all, Mary Jane was introduced as a literal joke. I don't mean that as like a description of the quality of her character's writing, I mean she was a literal gag. The idea being that Aunt May was just constantly trying to set Peter up with this woman, and because it's his aunt, he assumed it was not going to be a very good partnership, and it turned out to be Mary Jane. Stan Lee has openly said since then that while this was the original intention of Mary Jane, just for her to be part of this one-time gag, over time, he and the other creators at Marvel found there was more and more to this character, and more characterization and focus was turned towards her. We are directly in that phase of this character's history, past her introduction and the earliest notions of this character, deeper as we start to transition into the Bronze Age of comics, into a more sophisticated character beyond what Gwen Stacy was and is in this issue. Mary Jane doesn't say and do much here, but already there's a little bit more of a character here. One that's bemused and quietly watches all the events of this issue unfold around her, just baffled at the sheer madness that is Peter Parker's life, which in retrospect is really funny given that she would eventually be wrapped up in all of this stuff and it would become normal to her, really. She would recognize the events of this comic now as just familiar, everyday Peter Parker stuff. But Gwen's character, in comparison, is a lot more middle of the road. She's basically just there to be upset at the events of this comic, and there isn't a ton of character there until her and Mary Jane start talking to each other and there's this clear sense of tension between them. My point being not that Gwen Stacy's character is bad, it's just a lot more typical and wouldn't really start to get the color and interesting aspects to it that it would in a few years once Jerry Conroy takes over, and well, we'll get into what happens with Gwen very shortly. But I'm very glad we are able to review a part of Mary Jane's history pre her being the central love interest in Spider-Man's life, back when she was second fiddle to Gwen Stacy. It's interesting to look back in this comic and see how Stan Lee treated this character, and to be honest, I can see what Stan Lee has always said about this character, and you can see the gears turning behind this comic as Mary Jane is starting to become more and more of a character and a factor in Spider-Man's life. She doesn't really have any business being here, but she's not an unwelcome presence because, like Harry, she fills in Spider-Man's life a little bit beyond just Captain Stacy, Aunt May, and Gwen Stacy. We're starting to get a sense of more characters and a broadened storyline, and a more sophisticated storytelling. This is a relatively simple comic. Basically, Spider-Man gets the flu and goes a little nutty about it and almost unravels his entire life because of it. And while elements of that were put into the Spider-Man 2 movie, and other aspects of it have been used in other storylines and even just general superhero things when it comes to dealing with secret identities and how writers like to play with that idea, this is a pretty straightforward story, but still shows a lot of inklings into some deeper stuff. Yes, it is awfully convenient how Peter's able to just sort of sweep everything under the rug at the end of this issue, and yes, we are definitely stretching credulity at certain points in this comic, but this is a classic Spider-Man story for a reason, in part because a lot of what's old in this comic was new when it was first published. These were ideas that were first pioneered in these storylines that would later be piggybacked on in lots of other superhero stories and antics with secret identities. But a lot of this stuff was being done here first. Meanwhile, there's a lot of elegance behind all of this comic. Like in the Sam Raimi Spider-Man 2 movie, it's very much in the subtext of this comic that while Peter apparently lost his powers to the flu in this story, there's more psychological aspects to him briefly losing his powers here, and it has to do with the overall turmoil that is Peter Parker's life. Indeed, that's the note this comic ends on, not on a happy, goofy Silver Age one, but on the fact that even though Peter won the day, he can't make himself feel happy because it's all this struggle, because he's still in his early days as a superhero and trying to figure out all these things out, and he knows that the Parker luck's gonna catch up to him sooner or later. There's something nice about the way this comic ends. It's not miserable, this isn't emo Spider-Man, and we're not anywhere close to that particular take on the character, but there is something somber to the ending, when it's just in that nice little shot with Peter under the spotlight. John Romita does the artwork in this comic, and as you might imagine, it's awesome. The images I'm using and what we're doing for this review happen to use restored works that have really sort of polished it off and used modern technology to make these comics look as good as possible, but I feel they do a really good job with this, conveying what this artwork originally intended rather than what's actually available and scanned from newsprint. It's better this way, and there's no way around that. It just simply looks nicer when we use modern technology to sort of polish the artwork a little bit here and there. And that's good because it's nice to see the original intent of this comic in its full glory. I like when they do this for reprints and digital releases of old issues like this because it's a nice way to work with some high quality images, but also focusing on classic artwork that hasn't been fundamentally altered in any important way. Yes, there's something to be said about classic newsprint, but for a comic like this, those classic newsprint issues are very rare by now and hard to get a hold of. So it's nice that something's available for the average consumer, because a comic like this is kind of a must-read. It's a real classic, it's a very cool comic to read, and an essential story in Spider-Man history, and just an excellent Stan Lee penned comic. Now it is worth noting that when we say Stan Lee wrote this thing, it means that he wrote, as he did with most of his comics from this era, a 2 to 3 page summary of the events and the general flow of this comic, and then John Romita and Jim Rumi were responsible for bringing the comic to life. They do a really good job at that, and their role in this storytelling shouldn't be underestimated. They are really responsible for making this whole story come to life, and that summary, while important, doesn't really compare to the work that Romita and Mooney did in making this a comic and something that you can look at and read. Stan Lee just presented a short story only a few pages long. These artists are the ones who turned that into a comic book, and their role in that shouldn't be underestimated and shouldn't be undervalued compared to the relative role that artists have in current comics. Which isn't to say that modern artists don't have a huge role in creating a comic book and bringing it to life, just that comparatively these early Marvel guys are really responsible for a lot of the storytelling that's a part of this classic Marvel stuff. Now all that being said, we shouldn't go too far in the other direction either and just credit Mooney and Romita for bringing this comic to life. Because I gotta tell you, as I find when I read any Stan Lee written comic, there's a lot of him in every single issue that he's responsible for. You can see it in the subtext of the writing that emphasizes the power and wonder of technology, that uses stuff like radiation and the children of the atom to dwell on and use then fears and concepts in that time period being the 1970s, and their culture to inform the story here. Stan Lee is actually a very smart and sophisticated storyteller, even when he's telling ostensibly simple stories about Spider-Man getting the flu and going a little nanners. There's a lot going on behind the scenes of that and just under the surface, and if you're looking, it's right there. And that subtext is 100% Stan Lee. Those politics are very much Stan Lee. He's in this comic very heavily and very visibly, so we shouldn't downplay his role in creating this issue and making it come to life any more than Ramita or Mooney's role in making this issue a thing. So, all that being said, absolutely yes, I recommend this one. It's a classic for a reason, and I'd consider it pretty essential. But we are talking about Mary Jane in this miniseries, and while I will be looking at the issue as a whole, since we might as well while we're here, it is worth noting this isn't the most important Mary Jane comic in the world. Her total appearances across all panels roughly equates to about a page worth in an entire issue of this story, and the focus very much is on Spider-Man and Gwen Stacy. That's okay, because it's a classic Spider-Man story, and to be honest, even if we're looking at this from a Mary Jane perspective, any issue along these lines is very valuable in getting a sense of what Mary Jane's character was like before the death of Gwen Stacy, and before Mary Jane became more and more of a central figure in Spider-Man lore. Looking back on it all, though, it's pretty good. Mary Jane's a character here, not just a bland cardboard cutout of a character or some idea of a character. There's a sense of a person there, even if she doesn't have the biggest role in this particular story. And if you ask me, her character's only going to get better from here. Because next up, as randomly decided by random chance, we're going to be going a few years ahead into the future, into the Jerry Conroy era, and I'm really looking forward to it. And it's another issue that I totally remember reading from long, long ago when I was going through these classic Spider-Man comics for the first time. And that one's going to involve Mary Jane a little bit more. So stay tuned for that. Let me know what you guys think of this new 10-part miniseries we're going to be doing. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.